Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com and devnursery.com. And what I want to do today is just talk about sort of the concept of a single page application and like what makes this different than other ways to build your website. So let's just kind of go over kind of the evolution of websites. So in the beginning, there was really just the browser. So let me just make a shape. So let's make a square. So there was really just the browser. Okay, and then we're going to make this shape. Let's see here. I think this is the fill. Make this sort of a lightish orange. Okay. And we just had the browser. Okay, and the browser could read HTML and CSS. In the beginning, really, it was just HTML. And you did everything in your HTML. So if you might remember like bold tag, like B tags and I tags to make things bold and italics. You know, there was a lot of you did a lot in your HTML. And the problem with that is you had like a separate HTML file for each website, for each web page. So you have to kind of redo everything every single time. So making really huge, long, sprawling web pages was quite a daunting task. As browsers got more sophisticated, they allowed you to break up how you design your website into CSS and JavaScript. So CSS allowed you to separate your styling, how your page looks like, into a separate file. So that way you don't have to redo like what's bold, what's centered, what's all this stuff over and over again. And then we introduced JavaScript with Netscape in I think like 1995, 1994, something like that. And that allows the ability for you to kind of manipulate your website after the website renders. So you can actually move stuff around, you can have little alerts pop up, do all sorts of cool stuff you couldn't do before. But everything had to render sort of in the browser, okay? And basically, so you only had a front end. This is what's known as sort of the front end, everything that gets rendered by the browser. Okay, so let's label that. Text box right over here. So again, whenever you think of the browser, your Google Chrome, your Firefox, your Internet Explorers, this is your front end. Okay, let's make that white. Let's just position that a little bit better. There we go. So this is your front end code. And nowadays, they've added a fourth thing. Browsers can now also interpret WebAssembly, WASM. Not necessarily relevant for today's conversation, but just so you're aware of it, it is a new technology, a very interesting technology that I have talked about and probably will talk about again. But essentially, your browser, when you wanted to go to a website, would send a request out into the interwebs. So what I wanted, no, I think I want something over here, arrows. So it would send a request out into the interwebs. And this was a request. This is what's referred to as a request. And then that request would get to some server somewhere. So actually, let's copy this one over here. Okay. And this would be your server. So this is not on your computer. So if you're the person who's typing in google.com in your browser, there's some other computer somewhere that's a server that other code's going to run. Okay? And I mean, this could be like Ruby on Rails. This could be like, and this server could be running kind of any programming language. It doesn't have to be HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, because the reason why it has to be HTML, CSS, and JavaScript in the browser is because every developer doesn't know what's on your computer. So if you had some custom browser that could use some other language, how are they supposed to know that? They have to assume that everyone's going to have whatever the standard browser specs are, which is HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. WASM will change that in the future, but on the server side, there's only one computer that the code's running on. So I send no matter who you are, where you are around the world, and you send the request for google.com, it's going to go to a Google server, and they're all going to run sort of uniform software. So they could use whatever they want. So you could, use Python and use their software, Django, for running a web server. I'll make this a little bit wider. You could be running JavaScript and using Node and Express. Okay, we'll make this even a little bit wider. The requests don't need to be so big. Okay. It could be using the Go programming language in their framework called Buffalo. It could be using Rust, which has Rocket as their backend framework. You could even be using Swift, which has Vapor, and Kotlin, which has Ktor. And then there's Elixir, which I think has Phoenix. You can literally use any programming language. And that server would do several different things. Okay, so typically what it does is that once that request hits your server running whatever software you're running, the first thing it's going to do, it's going to route that request to, so your server in these languages will have directions saying when someone makes a particular request to a particular URL, how to handle it. That's called your routes. So your server handles routing. So this is why this is referred to as the backend. Okay, because all this stuff happens not in the front end on the browser, it happens on, all this code is executed on a server somewhere. So this is backend code. So whenever you think of backend versus front end, the question is, where does the code run? When you're actually doing it, it kind of bleeds into each other because, you know, your application has code that runs in different places. But the backend code is the code that runs on the server, is the server that handles the routing, that handles, oh, let's go back over here. The server handles pulling information from a database. So it's the code that's going to sit there and connect to a database and pull the information from the database. And it's the code that might render templates. Okay, and generally it does in that order. So your request hits the server, it finds the appropriate route, which pulls the right information from the database, and then renders a template that creates the website with like the user's information. So all this has to happen first, and once all that happens, then the server gives a response. It's a mix of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that hits your browser and shows you the website that you want. That basically, the server put together this code that will then run in your browser, that will then run in the front end. And this is fine. This is cool. You can make very dynamic websites. So again, once upon a time, there was just the front end. Then later on, they developed the idea of running web servers and being able to have routing, databases, template rendering, all this kind of stuff. Okay, and let me just add C# and .NET there. Don't want to forget them. C#, .NET, cool. Now, the problem is, when you went on the website and you click on a link on the website to another page on the website, guess what would happen? Another request would be sent. It would have to go to the server, have to get routed, then the database would have to be queried again, and the template would have to be rendered again and send you another response. So every time you went from page to page, there was this sort of, you know, not a long wait time, but a wait time nonetheless, and this little flicker, because your page would sort of change. Okay? You know, and just to kind of show you an example of this, I'll go to a project I made that's like this. So we go to my website, alexmercedcoder.com. Okay, here you can go, you know, follow me on YouTube, GitHub, LinkedIn, and then join one of the communities we have here. Okay, I highly recommend joining them. Most people end up joining the Slack, but there's 3 of the more popular community pages you can join. Highly recommend it. But if we go to Evolve, that's this app right here. Okay, we'll let that load for a moment. Okay, but the idea is that this website I'm about to load is a website I made with sort of this design. So when you click on when you click on a link, it's going to send a request to a server, in this case done through Node and Express, that will route the request, pull from a database, and then render a template. Okay, so now if I go to another page, so you might notice like there's like a little bit of a flicker. Now if I go to, well, really right now I have it set up where basically you can really only go to the login and user page. But you see there's like a little flicker, like the page reloads. The reason is because you're sending that response. And right now it's running nice and smooth, but it's still not the smoothest experience. So what someone said is like, how about this? Why do we need to render the template here? Okay, because that's just a lot of time to sit there and put together all this code here on the server side. So how about we change it and we get rid of that? Okay, what we'll do instead is we'll have instead of having a website with like multiple pages, each of them being a separate HTML file that requires a separate request, we're going to create instead a single page application, which is all run on the front end. So instead, this is going to ship a single page application. This is generally done like Angular, React, Vue. But the idea is that basically your entire website's built in JavaScript. All your HTML is in your JavaScript for the most part. All your CSS is in the JavaScript for the most part. And because it's HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, your browser can do all the rendering. Okay, so none of this has to sit there and assembled in the back end. But what you do is you don't put in all the information. So like the user information, all that stuff, doesn't get actually pulled out of the database till after this application has been sent over. So you're sending over this bundle of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and once it's loaded in the browser, what's going to happen is that this application will then pull from an API. So in this case, we replace the templating with an API, which again, instead of having to actually render a bunch of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, is just grabbing the data from the database and sending it over via request, an API request, as JSON data. So it's a lot faster because it's smaller bits of data and only called as it's needed. So then this application is constantly making like AJAX requests, or AJAX stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. So just making API requests, pulling in the data they need, and the JavaScript is then rendering the page onto the DOM. So in this case, every time you click on a page on the website, you're not going through this whole request response cycle. The page is already there. Technically, the application already has all the pages. So to show you an example, going back to alexmercedcoder.com. Boop, boop, boop. There we go. Oh, that went too far. So if I go to actually I want to go over here. I mean, technically these are single page applications. Actually, this is a good example. We'll use this one, Savvy Hotspots. Now this was done using React. This one was done using Angular. My portfolio page was using Stencil. I tried to do a little bit of everything, but let that load. Okay. Now, what you're going to see here is that the experience when you click from page to page is going to be a lot smoother, because you're not waiting for the server to render the whole thing. Now, again, you're seeing it take a little while because when you use Netlify, the free services at Netlify or Heroku, if your website isn't accessed very often, the initial load after a while can take a little bit of time. So that's why you're seeing this initial load. But watch what happens once the website actually loads. So you're only really loading the website once, and all the pages are included. That's kind of the benefit. You're bundling it as one big JavaScript package. There we go. So here's a few pages, but now like if I click, I mean we're already on the home page, but if I click Historic District, see the page loaded up pretty quickly. What took like a millisecond was these different items, because basically what happened is when the page loaded, so if I go back to home, see it's like instant. I go back here, there is a moment in which my website sent a request to my server to get the data from the database for these, but the rendering of these onto the DOM didn't happen via like a template. It was all done through the application, which is already loaded on your computer from when you first brought up the website. So in that case, you can go from page to page much faster. And now here I can just type in the zip code. I type in that zip code. Okay. Or I said 10005. Okay. I just type in that zip code. See, it's just doing another API request and loading on the page. But I'm not loading a whole new web page. I'm just pulling in the information from that API request and rendering it. So in that case, all the work is being done by the browser. and is just occasionally making API requests as needed to give the information to the single page application. That's the benefit of it. See, it's a lot smoother moving from page to page. It's a lot better user experience, but it's also a lot less wear and tear on your server, because your server is not making a big request every few seconds as they click through the website. They're just making one giant request when they first load the web page, and then after that, it's just a bunch of really small API requests. And the cool thing is, this API, this backend is a separate application from your front end. So there's two separate pieces. Like for example, Savvy Hotspots here, I have it hosted on Netlify, but the actual server, the backend here is done in PHP, is hosted on Heroku separately. You know, they only know each other through the API requests. They don't have to be built into the same application. And the benefit of that is, again, smaller requests, but also the modularity of it. Because now that same backend, that same PHP backend I have hosted on Heroku, I could make API requests there for a mobile app. I could make API requests to that application for a desktop app. So I don't have to recreate the backend for each application. The same API can be used each time because the API is just serving up data. Okay? So essentially these are two applications. Essentially here, you make when you go to this website, you're making a request to Netlify, who sends this website, and then this website's making API requests to my backend application on Heroku. So essentially you're separating all of this from this instead of making it all one big bundle like in that previous application I showed. So hopefully this makes the concept of a single page application a lot more tangible, and also you can appreciate sort of the benefits. Now, what frameworks are used to make single page applications? React, Angular, Vue. I think you can use Ember. I haven't used Ember before. There is Svelte. I like Svelte a lot. I like Stencil a lot. But all of these allow you to sort of make these types of applications. Generally, the thought process is always the same. Basically, you're doing all the templating really on the front end, and all the interpolation on the front end that you would normally do on the back end once upon a time. And essentially what it does is that all of these kind of bind your data to the DOM in the sense that if the variables change, your code automatically updates the DOM for you. Okay, it's not like the old days when you would use something like jQuery, and jQuery is fine, but in jQuery it didn't automatically track your data. So as your data changed, you would have to go back and put in jQuery code to go re-render the DOM, get rid of the old stuff, put in some new stuff, so that way you can reflect the change. The great thing about these frameworks is that they take care of all of the updating for you. So you just have to really focus on the logic and how the data relates to each other. And you can build really nice user interfaces. And again, you get this nice user experience because of the design structure. And you get the modularity to be able to use that same API for a mobile app, for a desktop app with Electron or something like that. Without having to rebuild these pieces. So just hopefully this gives you more context and sort of modern web design. This kind of idea of creating lots of different APIs is also can be referred to as like microservices, where instead of creating one big application or even one big API, you'll break up all your data into a lot of small little APIs that handle parts of your overall application. So that way you can, again, make it more modular, so that way you can reuse pieces as you need to. So I think now I'm just kind of droning on, so I'm going to leave you guys be. But again, check out my websites, alexmercedcoder.com, devnursery.com. Have a great day and enjoy.